I'm Judge Judy, and over the years I've heard every excuse imaginable from people who thought they were smarter than the law. I've listened to millionaires claim poverty, deadbeats pretend to be victims, and smooth-talking businessmen spin stories so elaborate that even they struggled to keep track of their own lies. But there are certain cases that stay with you, cases that remind you exactly why justice matters. The case of Elena Rodriguez versus Joseph Holloway was one of those cases. It started on what seemed like an ordinary Monday morning. The courtroom doors opened, and in walked a man who looked like he had stepped straight out of a luxury lifestyle magazine. Joseph Holloway carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed the world existed solely for his convenience. He wore an expensive-looking navy suit, tailored so perfectly that it appeared painted onto his body. A gleaming watch sat proudly on his wrist. His shoes looked untouched by dust, and every movement he made seemed carefully designed to project power and success. Behind him walked Elena Rodriguez, a woman whose entire appearance reflected years of hard work and sacrifice. She wore a simple dress and carried a worn folder clutched tightly against her chest. There was nothing flashy about her, no designer labels, no expensive jewelry, just tired eyes, nervous hands, and the quiet dignity of someone who had spent her life earning every dollar through honest labor. Before the hearing even began, I could see the contrast. On one side stood a man who wanted everyone to believe he owned the world. On the other stood a woman who only wanted what she had earned. As soon as both parties were seated, I reviewed the file in front of me. Elena was suing Joseph for unpaid wages. According to her claim, she had worked for him for 8 months as a housekeeper and property caretaker. She alleged that Joseph had paid her for only 1 month and then spent the next 7 months making excuse after excuse while continuing to demand her labor. The amount she sought was $15,000. For many people, $15,000 represents a significant amount of money. For Elena, it represented survival. It represented rent payments, groceries, school expenses for her children, and countless sacrifices she had made while trusting someone who kept promising he would do the right thing. I looked up and began the hearing. "Mr. Holloway," I said, "the plaintiff claims you employed her for 8 months and failed to pay her wages. What's your response?" Joseph immediately leaned back in his chair and smiled as though the entire proceeding amused him. "Your Honor," he began, "this lawsuit is completely ridiculous. I'm a successful businessman. I manage luxury properties worth millions of dollars. Why would I risk everything over $15,000? The accusation doesn't even make sense." I had heard variations of that argument many times. People often believe wealth automatically proves innocence. It doesn't. In fact, sometimes wealth, or the appearance of wealth, simply gives dishonest people more tools to hide behind. "So your position is that you owe her nothing?" I asked. "Correct," Joseph replied confidently. "She was an unreliable employee. She quit unexpectedly. She failed to perform her duties properly. Frankly, I offered her $500 just to avoid wasting my time dealing with this nonsense." Elena's expression tightened, but she remained silent. I turned toward her. "Ms. Rodriguez, tell me what happened." She took a deep breath before speaking. Her voice was soft but steady. "Your Honor, I worked for him 6 days every week. I cleaned 5 different houses. Sometimes I worked 10 hours a day, sometimes more. We agreed on $2,000 per month. He paid me the first month. After that, every time payday came, he told me there was a problem." She opened her folder and carefully removed several sheets of paper. "He always had a reason, a bank issue, a delayed transaction, a business deal, something. He always promised next week." I watched Joseph while she spoke. He seemed bored, occasionally rolling his eyes as though listening to her was beneath him. That attitude alone told me plenty. Elena continued. I trusted him because he looked successful. He talked about his business constantly. He told me he owned luxury properties and had investors. I believed him. Every month he said he would pay double next month, then double again. Eventually he owed me more money than I had ever earned in my life. And why didn't you stop working? I asked. Because I needed the money, she answered honestly. I'm raising 2 children alone. By the time I realized he wasn't paying me, he already owed me thousands. If I quit, I thought I would never see any of it. So I kept hoping. There was something heartbreaking about that answer because it reflected a reality many hard-working people face. When someone already owes you money, walking away often feels impossible. You continue investing time because you desperately want to believe the promises will eventually become reality. What happened when you finally demanded payment? I asked. Elena looked down briefly before answering. He got angry, very angry. He told me I should be grateful for the opportunity. He said, if I caused problems, he would make things difficult for me. Then he fired me through a text message. Joseph immediately interrupted. That's completely false. I held up my hand. You'll get your turn. Elena handed several pages to the bailiff. These are the messages. Your Honor, I began reading. The first message was simple. Don't worry, your money is coming next week. Another message read, the bank delayed a transfer. I'll pay you Friday. Another, big investment deal closing soon. You'll get everything owed. There were dozens of messages. Promise after promise. Excuse after excuse. Yet no payments. I looked directly at Joseph. These messages came from your phone. Yes, he admitted. But they're being misinterpreted. Really, I replied. Because what I see is a man repeatedly acknowledging a debt. I was trying to be polite, Joseph said. I didn't want confrontation. You call 7 months of broken promises polite? I asked. I call it manipulation. For the first time, Joseph's smile weakened. He clearly wasn't accustomed to people challenging him. Many individuals spend years building carefully crafted identities. They surround themselves with people who tell them what they want to hear. Then they walk into a courtroom expecting the same treatment. Unfortunately for them, that's not how my courtroom works. Mr. Holloway, I continued, you keep emphasizing your success. Let's talk about that. How much do you claim your company is worth? His confidence immediately returned. Several $100 million. And your personal net worth? Over $200 million. The audience shifted slightly in their seats. Those are enormous numbers. Most people hearing them would naturally assume the speaker must be incredibly wealthy. I simply wrote the figures down. Interesting, I said. And yet we're here discussing $15,000. Because it's about principle, Joseph answered quickly. I refuse to reward dishonesty. I turned back to Elena. Do you have anything else? She nodded and produced photographs, hundreds of them. Images showing her cleaning kitchens, scrubbing floors, maintaining properties, and working inside homes over many months. The timestamps covered nearly the entire period, she claimed. I took pictures because I was afraid, she admitted. I knew something wasn't right. I wanted proof that I was there. That statement struck me. Imagine working every day while secretly documenting your labor because deep down you suspect your employer might never pay you. That isn't employment. That's exploitation. Joseph dismissed the photos with a wave of his hand. Anyone can take pictures. Anyone can, I replied, but not everyone can fake 8 months of evidence. Elena then presented handwritten logs detailing her hours, every property, every date, every task. The records were meticulous. Meanwhile, Joseph had produced nothing. No payroll records, no performance warnings, no termination notices, no evidence supporting his claim that Elena had performed poorly. Just words. And in court, words without evidence are often worthless. Mr. Holloway, I said, Where are your records? He hesitated. My office handles those. Did you bring them? No. Why not? I didn't think they would be necessary. I leaned forward. You came to court accused of stealing 8 months of labor and didn't think employment records would be necessary? His face tightened. I didn't say that. That's exactly what you implied. For the first time, the courtroom atmosphere shifted. The confidence Joseph had displayed when he entered was beginning to crack. Arrogance works best when nobody challenges it. Once questions begin, arrogance often collapses under its own weight. Still, Joseph continued insisting he was a wealthy executive who simply refused to pay a dishonest employee. And that's when he made the mistake that would eventually destroy everything. I asked a simple question. If $15,000 means nothing to you, why not just pay her? Most people would have answered carefully. Joseph didn't. Instead, he puffed out his chest and smiled. Because I don't reward lies. Besides, I could pay her right now if I wanted. I have $80,000 sitting in my checking account this very minute. The courtroom became silent. Elena stared at him. I stared at him. And Joseph, convinced he had impressed everyone, sat there proudly waiting for admiration that never came. Because the moment those words left his mouth, I knew something he didn't. I knew that people who genuinely possess wealth rarely feel the need to advertise it, and people who constantly advertise it are often hiding something much smaller behind the curtain. I calmly folded my hands and looked directly into his eyes. You have $80,000 in your checking account right now? He nodded confidently. That's correct. You're certain? Absolutely. I allowed a brief silence to fill the room. Then I said 6 words that instantly drained the color from his face. Good. Let's verify that claim. I have presided over thousands of disputes throughout my career, and one lesson has remained consistent. The truth has a strange way of revealing itself when people are forced to stop performing and start answering questions. Up until that moment, Joseph Holloway had controlled the room through confidence. He had entered the courtroom, projecting power, wealth, and superiority. He spoke as if every statement he made should be accepted without challenge. But confidence built on deception is fragile. The instant I suggested verifying his claim about having $80,000 in his checking account, I watched something change in him. His posture stiffened. His eyes darted toward the exit. The relaxed smile disappeared from his face. Suddenly, the wealthy executive who claimed to own a vast empire looked less like a powerful businessman and more like a man desperately searching for a way out of a trap he had built himself. Verify, he repeated. What exactly do you mean by verify? I folded my hands and looked directly at him. I mean exactly what I said. You just testified that you have $80,000 sitting in your checking account. That's a factual statement. Facts can be verified. A nervous laugh escaped his mouth. Your Honor, surely you're not suggesting that my private banking information is relevant to this case. You made it relevant, I replied. Not me. He shifted in his seat. I simply meant that I'm financially stable. No, I corrected him. You specifically said $80,000. Those were your exact words. The courtroom was silent. Elena sat motionless, her hands folded tightly together. For months she had listened to this man boast about his success while refusing to pay her. Now she was witnessing the first crack in the image he had spent years creating. Joseph tried another approach. Even if I did have that amount, surely I'm entitled to financial privacy. Of course you are, I said. But when someone comes into my courtroom bragging about their wealth while claiming they can't or won't pay wages, their credibility becomes relevant. Very relevant. His jaw tightened. I'm a respected businessman. Then verification shouldn't bother you. He opened his mouth, closed it, and looked away. That reaction alone told me more than any bank statement ever could. People who are telling the truth generally welcome evidence. Liars fear it. I requested that he provide the information necessary to verify the account. The panic in his eyes became impossible to hide. He stalled. He searched his phone. He claimed he couldn't remember account details. He said his assistant handled banking matters. He insisted he had multiple accounts spread across different institutions. Every answer created more questions, and every question pushed him deeper into a corner. Finally, after several uncomfortable minutes, he provided the information. The courtroom remained silent as arrangements were made to verify the balance. During that silence, I watched Joseph carefully. Sweat had formed on his forehead. He adjusted his tie repeatedly. His confidence was evaporating one nervous gesture at a time. Elena, meanwhile, sat quietly. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't celebrating. She simply watched. Sometimes people who have been mistreated for a long time stop expecting justice. They become afraid to hope because disappointment hurts too much. Elena looked like someone who had learned that lesson the hard way. When the verification process finally began, every person in that courtroom seemed to lean forward simultaneously. Joseph stared at the floor. Elena held her breath. Even members of the audience sensed something significant was about to happen. The result arrived moments later, and it was devastating. Instead of $80,000, Joseph's account contained barely a few $100s. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The silence felt enormous. Then a wave of reactions spread across the room. Audible gasps, shocked expressions, disbelief. Joseph's face turned pale. Elena looked stunned, and I sat there looking at a man whose entire story had just collapsed. "Would you like to explain that?" I asked calmly. "There must be a mistake," he replied immediately. "A misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding," I repeated. "You claimed $80,000. The account contains a few hundred." "I was thinking of other accounts." "That isn't what you said. My finances are complicated." "No," I replied. "The truth is actually very simple." He began talking faster. "I have investments. I have assets. I have business interests. My money is diversified." I had heard enough. "Mr. Holloway, when someone says they have $80,000 in their checking account, that statement has one meaning. Not 5 meanings, not 10 meanings. 1. The problem for Joseph wasn't simply that he had exaggerated. The problem was that his entire defense relied on credibility. He had spent the hearing portraying Elena as dishonest while presenting himself as trustworthy. Now, the foundation of that argument had disappeared. If he lied about something so easily verifiable, why should anyone believe anything else he said? The answer was obvious. We shouldn't. But the surprises weren't over. Once credibility becomes questionable, other claims deserve scrutiny as well. So I turned my attention toward the empire Joseph kept describing. "Let's discuss your company," I said. "You testified that you're the CEO." "Yes," he answered quickly. "Tell me about your ownership interest." His hesitation lasted only a moment, but it was enough. "I have equity." "How much?" Another pause. "A percentage." "What percentage?" He swallowed hard. 5. The audience stirred again. 5%? I asked. "Yes." "So you don't own the company?" "I'm an executive." "That wasn't my question." His confidence continued shrinking. "No." "Are you the CEO?" Silence. "No." "What is your actual title?" His voice dropped almost to a whisper. "Vice President of Operations." Elena looked stunned. For 8 months, she had listened to this man describe himself as the owner of a real estate empire. Now she was discovering he wasn't even the chief executive. Every layer of the image was peeling away. One lie exposed another, then another, then another. It happens often. Deception is rarely isolated. People who lie about one major thing usually lie about many things because maintaining a false identity requires constant reinforcement. I continued asking questions. Did he personally own the luxury properties? No, the company owned them. Did he own the mansion he claimed was his residence? No, he rented an apartment. Did he personally control millions in assets? No, most of the assets belonged to the company. Every answer reduced his supposed empire further, yet perhaps the most symbolic moment involved the watch he had worn into court. The watch had been displayed proudly all morning. It was designed to communicate status, success, wealth, power. "How much is the watch worth?" I asked. "I'm not sure," he answered. "You're not sure?" "Not exactly. You've been displaying it all morning." He hesitated. Then reality finally emerged. "It isn't genuine." "What does that mean?" "It's a replica." The audience erupted. I allowed a moment for the revelation to sink in. A fake watch, a fake title, a fake fortune, a fake image. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Elena's attorney then introduced additional evidence. Investigators had examined Joseph's claims after settlement discussions failed. What they discovered was remarkable. The luxury suit he wore to court wasn't his. It came from a rental service. The designer briefcase wasn't his either. Neither was much of the image he presented to the world. Piece by piece, the illusion collapsed. Joseph sat there listening as years of carefully cultivated appearances dissolved in a matter of minutes. Yet despite everything, the most disturbing part of the case wasn't the fake watch or the rented suit. It wasn't even the exaggerated claims about wealth. The most disturbing part was what those lies had enabled him to do. Because while Joseph was busy pretending to be a millionaire, Elena had been working. While he projected success, she scrubbed floors. While he attended business events and spoke about luxury properties, she cleaned them. And while he maintained an image of prosperity, he refused to pay the woman whose labor helped sustain that image. That is what angered me. Not the arrogance, not the boasting, the exploitation. I turned toward Elena. "How did this affect you?" She looked down dutifully before answering. "I lost everything." Her voice cracked for the first time. "I borrowed money from family. I missed rent payments. I sold my jewelry. My children saw me cry almost every night because I didn't know how I was going to buy food." The courtroom became silent again. Those words carried more weight than any financial document, because behind every unpaid wage is a human consequence. Behind every broken promise is a family forced to carry the burden, Elena continued. "I kept believing him. Every time he promised to pay me, I believed him. I thought successful people kept their word." Joseph stared at the table. For once he had nothing to say. No speech, no excuse, no performance, just silence. I looked at him and asked one final question. "Mr. Holloway, after everything we've discussed today, do you still maintain that Elena is lying?" He opened his mouth, then closed it. Several seconds passed. Finally he spoke. "No." It was the first honest answer he had given all day. Elena lowered her head and quietly wiped away tears. Not tears of victory, tears of relief. Because after months of being ignored, dismissed, and manipulated, the truth had finally been acknowledged. But the hearing wasn't over. Not even close. Because now that the lies had been exposed, it was time to determine exactly how much those lies were going to cost him. And as Joseph sat there staring at the table, he still didn't realize that the worst part of the day was yet to come. The financial judgment would hurt. The public humiliation would hurt. But what would happen after he walked out of that courtroom would destroy the very identity he had spent years trying to create. And by the time the final ruling arrived, the man who entered believing he controlled everything would discover that lies eventually collect a debt of their own, and that debt was finally about to become due. I'm Judge Judy, and one thing I've learned after decades on the bench is that lies can survive for a surprisingly long time. Some people build entire lives around them. They create false images, false reputations, and false identities so convincing that eventually even they begin believing their own stories. But no lie survives forever. Sooner or later, reality arrives with the bill. And as Joseph Holloway sat in my courtroom that morning, staring at the table in front of him, reality had finally arrived. The confident man who had walked through my courtroom doors claiming to be a multi-millionaire CEO no longer existed. The expensive image had cracked beyond repair. His bank balance had been exposed. His fake title had been exposed. His fake watch had been exposed. His rented suit had been exposed. Most importantly, his treatment of Elena Rodriguez had been exposed. Yet despite everything that had already happened, the most important decision still remained. The purpose of a courtroom is not humiliation. It is justice. Public embarrassment may be a consequence of bad behavior, but accountability is the objective. And accountability was exactly what Joseph was about to face. I looked toward Elena first. She sat quietly at the plaintiff's table, exhausted but composed. The strength it had taken for her to reach this moment was obvious. Many people would have given up long ago. Most workers in her situation never see justice because the process is intimidating, expensive, and emotionally draining. For 8 months, she had worked while waiting for promises that never materialized. Then she spent additional months fighting simply to be heard. That kind of perseverance deserves recognition. Mrs. Rodriguez, I said, you claimed $15,000 in unpaid wages. Based on the evidence presented today, I find your testimony credible. Tears immediately filled her eyes. Not because she had won yet, but because for the first time, someone in authority had officially acknowledged what she had been saying all along. The truth matters. Being believed matters. Especially after months of being treated like you don't matter at all. I turned toward Joseph. Mr. Holloway, you entered this courtroom claiming to be the victim of an attempted extortion. Instead, the evidence has shown a pattern of deception, manipulation, and exploitation. He remained silent. You hired Ms. Rodriguez. You benefited from her labor. You repeatedly acknowledged owing her money. You promised payment over and over again. Then you failed to pay. Still silence. Do you disagree with any of those facts? He slowly shook his head. No, Your Honor. The answer came quietly, almost painfully. For perhaps the first time in a very long time, Joseph was confronting reality without a script, without a performance, without a carefully rehearsed image, just reality. Good, I said. Because facts matter. The courtroom was completely silent. Every person present knew the ruling was coming, but before delivering it, I wanted Joseph to understand something important. Mr. Holloway, I continued, people often think wealth is measured by money. It isn't. Character is wealth. Integrity is wealth. Keeping your word is wealth. And based on everything I've seen today, those are assets you've been bankrupt in for quite some time. Several people in the audience nodded. Joseph stared at the floor. You spent months pretending to be successful while refusing to pay a woman who earned every dollar she requested. You drove expensive vehicles. You wore luxury clothing. You projected status. Meanwhile, the person actually doing the work was struggling to feed her family. That is not success. That is failure disguised as success. His shoulders dropped lower. You didn't just owe her money. You owed her honesty. You owed her respect. You owed her basic decency. Instead, you gave her excuses. Elena quietly wiped another tear from her cheek. I then delivered the ruling. Judgment is awarded to the plaintiff in the amount of $15,000 for unpaid wages. Elena covered her mouth with both hands. But I wasn't finished. Additionally, I continued, the evidence demonstrates repeated bad faith conduct, intentional delays, and threats that caused significant emotional distress. Therefore, additional damages are warranted. Joseph finally looked up. Panic immediately returned to his face. Your Honor, I raised a hand. You've had plenty of opportunities to speak." He fell silent. An additional $10,000 is awarded. Audible gasps spread through the courtroom. Joseph's face turned completely pale. Elena looked stunned. "Furthermore," I said, "legal costs and court-related expenses are awarded in the amount of $4,500. The total was devastating. Joseph looked as though the air had been knocked from his lungs. "Your Honor," he whispered, "I can't pay that." I looked directly at him. "That is unfortunate. I don't have the money. That wasn't a concern when you were pretending to have $80,000 in your checking account." The courtroom became silent once again. Joseph looked trapped because in many ways he was. Every excuse now contradicted his own testimony. Every attempt to claim poverty directly conflicted with the image he had spent hours promoting. He had built a prison out of his own lies. "You will satisfy this judgment," I said firmly, "however long it takes, however difficult it becomes." Ms. Rodriguez waited months for money she earned. "You can spend some time learning what accountability feels like." Elena lowered her head and began crying openly now. Not dramatic tears, not theatrical tears. The kind of tears that come when someone has been carrying a burden for too long and finally realizes they can put it down. "I've seen those tears many times. They never stop affecting me, because behind every case file is a human life. Behind every judgment is a real story, and behind every victory is often a great deal of suffering that nobody else ever saw." I formally concluded the case and struck the gavel. Judgment for the plaintiff. The sound echoed through the courtroom. For Elena, it sounded like freedom. For Joseph, it sounded like consequences. As the hearing ended, people began filing out of the courtroom. Elena remained seated for a moment, trying to process what had happened. Her attorney quietly spoke with her. Joseph remained frozen in place. The man who had entered believing he controlled the narrative now looked completely lost. Eventually he stood and slowly walked toward the exit. No confidence, no swagger, no arrogance. Just silence. But the story didn't end when he left the courtroom. In many ways, it was only beginning. Within hours, clips of the hearing began circulating online. Viewers were fascinated by the dramatic collapse of a man who had spent so much energy pretending to be someone he wasn't. People shared the footage everywhere. The fake CEO, the fake millionaire, the fake empire. The story spread rapidly because it represented something larger than one courtroom dispute. It represented accountability. It represented the idea that appearances can only hide reality for so long. The attention eventually reached Joseph's employer. Company executives reviewed the footage. They examined his public representations. They looked into claims he had made while identifying himself as CEO. The results were predictable. Within days, his employment ended. The organization simply could not trust someone whose credibility had been so publicly destroyed. The consequences continued. Creditors began asking questions. Business relationships deteriorated. Friends who had admired his success suddenly realized much of it had never existed. Invitations stopped arriving. Phone calls stopped coming. People who once wanted to be associated with Joseph disappeared remarkably quickly. That's another lesson life teaches repeatedly. People attracted to an image usually leave when the image disappears. Meanwhile, Elena's life began moving in the opposite direction. The judgment was eventually collected. It wasn't easy. It wasn't immediate. But justice rarely works at the speed people want. Eventually, she received every dollar she was owed. And unlike Joseph, she understood the value of honest work. Instead of spending the money chasing appearances, she invested it carefully. She launched a small cleaning service of her own. She hired women who had experienced similar hardships. She built a business based on reliability, fairness, and respect. Within a few years, the company expanded beyond anything she had originally imagined. The woman who had once struggled to pay rent became an employer herself, not because someone handed her success, but because she earned it. Sometimes people ask whether I feel sorry for defendants like Joseph. The answer is complicated. I believe people can change. I believe people can learn. I believe people deserve opportunities to become better versions of themselves. But meaningful change requires honesty. It requires acknowledging reality. And Joseph spent so many years avoiding reality that by the time it finally arrived, the consequences were unavoidable. What happened to him wasn't bad luck. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't persecution. It was accountability, pure and simple. The truth is that Joseph never lost a fortune because he never had one. He never lost an empire because there wasn't one. What he actually lost was the illusion he had spent years creating, and perhaps that was necessary, because sometimes the first step toward becoming an honest person is losing the lie you've been hiding behind. As for Elena, she reminded everyone in that courtroom of something important. Strength doesn't always look powerful. Sometimes strength looks like a tired, single mother carrying a folder full of evidence. Sometimes strength looks like continuing to fight when nobody believes you. Sometimes strength looks like refusing to surrender simply because someone wealthier, louder, or more influential wants you to disappear. Elena never gave up. That is why she won, and that is why this case remains memorable. Not because a fake millionaire was exposed, not because a dramatic courtroom moment went viral, not because of a bank account balance or a fake watch. The reason this story matters is because truth defeated deception, hard work defeated manipulation, and justice finally reached someone who had waited far too long to receive it. In the end, Joseph Holloway walked into my courtroom pretending to be a wealthy CEO with unlimited resources. He walked out as a man forced to confront the reality he had spent years avoiding. Elena Rodriguez walked into my courtroom as an unpaid worker desperate to be heard. She walked out with her dignity restored, her voice validated, and her future back in her own hands. And that is why, after all these years on the bench, I still believe the truth is the most powerful witness that can ever enter a courtroom. The end.